Hello, welcome to the channel. Today we're going to talk about accessing Logic Apps MCP servers using an API key. Let's go. So we've recently made some updates to our MCP offering in Logic Apps, and this includes support for API keys. So while Entra ID is used by many organizations and generally simplifies implementing a unified security scheme, there are situations where you need some flexibility. Now, this flexibility usually shows up when you need to support heterogeneous environments where perhaps Entra ID isn't available. So this becomes particularly important with like non-Microsoft agents and services where they may not have support for Entra ID, or it might not be available. Now, API key becomes a means to go ahead and address those use cases, and that's one of the core reasons why we've gone ahead and added this support. Okay, so when you enable Logic Apps as an MCP server, and this includes whether you're doing this manually or you're using another experience like API Center or Foundry, we're going to go ahead and update the host.json file, and we're going to go ahead and include extensions, workflow, MCP server endpoints, enable is true. So that's the default configuration. Now, by default, we will go ahead and enable OAuth 2 and API key as default configurations. So by default, those are the authentication schemes that are supported. Now, if you want more control, these are your options. So you could indicate just OAuth 2, just API key, or just anonymous. And you would do that by setting authentication, then type equals the value. So in this configuration that we see here, it would only have API key available. We would not support OAuth 2. But in general, I would say use the default, but there might be situations where you want to use API key, and so the default will have the support that you need. So let's go ahead and see how we can go ahead and retrieve these API keys. Now, at this point, we are still in public preview for MCP server support, and we are going to be working on a user experience after Ignite where you can go ahead and see these keys, go ahead and regenerate these keys from within the Logic App experience. So this is more of a temporary solution. Well, this will be available long term, but you will be able to use a user experience instead of having to call these APIs yourself in the near future. Now, the first thing you're going to need is a token to go ahead and access these underlying APIs. And these APIs can be called through a REST client, which is kind of my preference. But for folks that like CLIs, knock yourself out, that works too. I find the easiest way to go ahead and generate a token, a bearer token, is to log into your Azure portal, log into like the instance that you're going to be using for your MCP server, and then go ahead and click on this Cloud Shell icon. That will then load up this particular experience. Then you go ahead and issue this command, AZ account get access token, and the resource or the scope is going to be the management.azure.com, which is our management APIs. So this is where you will go ahead and grab your token and then put it in Notepad. This will expire, depends on largely your tenant settings, but this is kind of temporary. But this will be a way for you to go ahead and use this in our subsequent calls. Now, our subsequent calls include, and once again, using REST or using CLI. I'm going to focus on the REST, but this is here for your reference as well. We're going to go ahead and send a post to the list MCP servers API. Now, you'll notice as part of this path, I'll include this path in the description. Also, there's a blog post available on this as well. But you're going to have to replace your subscription ID, your resource group name, your Logic App name as part of this particular call. Now, this is going to allow you to retrieve an API key. Now, there is one thing worth noting, is that by default, there's two keys, a primary and a secondary. And when both retrieving keys and when regenerating keys, you will go ahead and explicitly offer or indicate which key you're interested in. And so we'll see that in a demo here. So let's go ahead, let's jump over to VS Code, and I'm going to use a REST client called Bruno. You can use any REST client. You could use Postman if you wish. I've just started to use Bruno more recently, and so I'm going to go ahead and use that. Okay, so I've gotten my token as I described on the previous slides, and now I've gone ahead and pasted that list MCP URL into my URL box here. And notice I've also included this query parameter get API key equals true, because you can actually call this without the API key if you wish. Now I've gone ahead and sent my auth. This is going to be that bearer token. I'm not going to show you that, but that comes from that command line that I issued previously. And we at this point have no body, and I kind of want to do this on purpose to show you that we can control behavior. So we can go ahead and hit the send button. This is now going to go ahead and make a call. We can see we have the API key here. We can see we have the MCP URL for this MCP server, and we can see the name of the MCP server because we do support multiple MCP servers per Logic app. And then you can see we have the tools listed here as well. Now this is going to represent the primary key. So we can go ahead and actually provide a body, and this body is, let me just clean this up a bit. This body is going to go ahead and allow us to have more control as well. So let's just remove these comments. And the two is, the key type is a primary, is it secondary, and then not after. So just, giving us some control over like the filtering of like the value, like the timestamp, and that sort of thing. So I can go ahead and hit send, and this will go ahead and connect. If I go ahead and put in secondary, this will yield the other API key. So these are unique keys. So that's how we go ahead and retrieve these values. Now let's head back to the slides, and we'll talk about how can we regenerate new keys. Okay, so similarly, we've got APIs for regenerating key. So it's going to use this particular API, regenerate MCP server access key. You're going to see sort of a similar API path here. You've just got a different operation, and this will go ahead and regenerate the key for us as well. Once again, you can use the REST CLI, and you can use that same bearer token that you just went ahead and used and generated. So let's now see this over in VS Code. All right, so I'm now back in VS Code, and I've got my API call here, and so we can see it's the regenerate MCP server access key. And in this case, I do need to provide an input parameter, like is it secondary or primary. Now I'm going to regenerate secondary because I'm already using primary somewhere else. So let's go ahead and just send this across. I did update my auth token, the bearer token here as well. And you will see we have a 200 OK being returned here. So we don't actually return the new value. You would need to go back and call that prior URL, that prior API for listing the MCP servers, and then you would be able to go ahead and retrieve that particular value. All right, so how can we go ahead and use this in action? Now, obviously, you can go ahead and use this in VS Code, and you would kind of do this the same way that I've shown on other videos, where you go ahead and add the MCP server, and then you just do need to provide the API key in your configuration. So that is an option. Let me actually just quickly show you that. All right, so here's an example. I'm in VS Code. I've got my MCP server. We know that we can go into command palette, add MCP server, paste the URL, and then it'll get added here. So these are pointing at the same actual Logic app, and the first one is actually going to use OAuth 2, which is great, and then the second one is going to use the API key. Now what's important is you need to add this particular entry, so headers, and then this is super important, x-API key, and then your actual value. When you go ahead and then use this particular URL and you start this MCP server, it's actually going to use API key instead. So that's important, and we're going to see this X API key as well here shortly. All right, so back in the slides, we talked about VS Code. Now let's talk about a new capability in Agent Loop. So this is our Agent Loop, and Agent Loop now supports calling MCP servers. So we can go ahead and add an MCP server and then go ahead and call it. And yeah, so let's go ahead and see what that looks like over in the Azure portal. All right, so I'm in the Azure portal. I'm in a conversational agent. This would also work for autonomous, doesn't really matter. But I do want to go ahead and click add, and then there's a new entry here called add an MCP server preview, And these are built in, and we'll talk about that on a different video, but we now want to add an MCP server. What I'm going to go do is I'm going to go ahead and add new just to show you this experience. And then here you would go ahead and select key. So this is where, using your API before, where you're getting the MCP server URL, you'd go ahead and provide that there. This is where you would provide your actual key. And then, as I mentioned before, this is where you provide that key header name, and you would provide x-api-key. Now, I'm going to go ahead and discard these changes just because I already have an existing solution that's working. So I'll just go ahead and unwind those. And here I've got sort of an existing connection. So I should be able to go into a new chat session and now interact with this particular agent. Now, this agent doesn't do a ton of things, right? Like, we just have a simple prompt that says you're an IT operations agent. This is an MCP server. Behind the scenes, this MCP server is actually exposing some ServiceNow operations or tools. So creating an incident, updating an incident, closing an incident, etc. Okay, so let's start a new chat and let's interact with this MCP server. So we're just going to start off with a simple prompt of hi, and I want to create an incident. So at this point, what's happened is agent loop's gone out, connected to our MCP server, enumerated all of the available tools, and now can dynamically go ahead and call them. So this create incident wouldn't be possible without connectivity to our MCP server. So we know the API key is working. So here, let's say database is offline. It's hi, and assign to database. All right, and then sure enough, we can see that we've got a new ticket created that ends in 208. So life's good. All right, that concludes the demo. If you do like this content, please like and subscribe, and look for more content shortly. Thank you.